It was an autumn night, with the starry sky above, and the full moon casting a pale light over the sleeping city. Sarah, a young woman of 25, was at home, lying in bed, trying to fall asleep. Her small apartment in the city center was her refuge, but also her prison, especially during lonely nights like this. Sarah had lived alone since she moved to the city looking for a fresh start. The city was big and anonymous, and although she was excited about independence, the loneliness of the night always made her restless. It was as if something was waiting out there, in the shadows, to invade her fragile refuge. While she was deep in dark thoughts, a sharp sound made her jump out of bed. It was the sound of a window breaking, followed by stealthy footsteps in the building's hallway. Sarah's heart raced as she sat up in bed, eyes wide and ears straining. The sound of approaching footsteps felt like a macabre thump in her chest, and she felt a chill run down her spine. She could hear her own rapid, shallow breathing, mixed with the disturbing sound of footsteps. She fought to stay calm, wondering if she should call the police, but the feeling of vulnerability paralyzed her. The bedroom door opened slowly, creaking with a bone-chilling groan. A dark silhouette entered, and Sarah could just see the shape of someone. Her body was tense, and she whispered in a trembling voice, "Who's there?" There was no response, just the sound of footsteps getting even closer. Suddenly, the closet door slammed open, and Sarah let out a shrill scream as she saw a man in a sinister clown mask and a shiny knife in his hand. The mask hid his face, but his eyes were visible through the cold, empty sockets. Sarah felt her body go cold with terror as she stared at the masked killer. She was trapped in the closet, surrounded by darkness and the unknown. The killer didn't say a word, just looked at her with eyes that seemed devoid of any trace of humanity. They were the eyes of a predator, hungry for fear. Time seemed to have become elastic, and the seconds dragged by as Sarah struggled to breathe. The killer in the clown mask approached slowly, the knife glinting in the dim light coming through the window. She could smell his cold breath, mixed with the metallic smell of the knife. Sarah knew she had to do something, anything to survive. With a quick and impulsive movement, she pushed the killer with all her strength and managed to get out of the closet. Adrenaline coursed through her veins as she ran down the hallway, the killer in hot pursuit. The lights in the hallway turned off abruptly, plunging everything into total darkness. Sarah stumbled, falling to the cold, hard floor, but managed to get up quickly. The killer was almost reaching her when a piercing scream echoed through the building, followed by the sound of distant police sirens. The police were on the way. The killer's steps hesitated for a moment, and Sarah took the chance to escape through the building's front door, running into the street in search of help, leaving the killer behind in the darkness of the hallway. The city was waking up to the terrible reality of that night. Police arrived shortly after, finding Sarah terrified and shaking in the street. She reported what happened, but the killer had disappeared like a ghost, evading capture once again. The night of terror was just beginning, and Sarah knew the killer's shadow would follow her no matter where she went. The city was now on constant alert as the real-life killer continued to lurk in the shadows of the night, a sinister threat that no one could capture. The minutes dragged by like hours as Sarah, panting and in shock, hid in the dark street, waiting for the police to arrive. The sirens approached, cutting the silence of the night and bringing a ray of hope. Finally, the sidewalk was flooded with flashing red and blue lights, announcing the arrival of police cars. Sarah was relieved, but she also felt weak and shaky. She ran towards the police, who immediately calmed her down and took her to the safety of a police car. The questions started coming. Describe the man, the mask, what he said. The words came out of Sarah's mouth in a flood of terror and anxiety. Meanwhile, police searched the building for clues and the fleeing killer. The hallway lights were restored, revealing the site of the terrible confrontation. The gleaming knife was found lying on the hallway floor, but the killer had disappeared like a shadow, evading capture once again. Authorities made a concerted effort to collect evidence and interviewing neighbors, but leads were scarce. The killer was skilled at remaining hidden, as if he were a supernatural entity that only appeared in the worst nightmares. The search extended beyond the city's borders, but the killer's cold trail disappeared into dark alleys and gloomy alleys. Sarah, despite her traumatic encounter, was determined to help the police find whoever was responsible for her terrible agony. She provided every detail she could remember, describing the killer's clown mask and empty eyes. She couldn't forget that feeling of looking into the face of pure evil and feeling consumed by fear. As the weeks passed, fear continued to spread like a plague across the city. News about the real-life killer spread like wildfire, keeping everyone on alert. Sarah felt the killer's shadow around every corner, hidden in the shadows that danced in the moonlight. She was living an ongoing nightmare. Each night, she locked all the doors and windows in her apartment, the curtains drawn, the lights on. She could barely sleep, tormented by nightmares from that terrible night. Every noise on the street, every unfamiliar sound, made her jump out of bed, her heart hammering in her chest. Constant visits to the therapist were not enough to alleviate the trauma that haunted her. She felt like a prisoner of her own fear, unable to resume her normal life. Friends and family worried about her, but the killer's shadow was relentless, looming over her like a sinister specter. Then, one day, the police made a macabre discovery. The killer had left an ominous message painted on the wall of a dark alley not far from Sarah's building. "I'll always come back." Authorities were horrified by the killer's audacity and intensified their efforts to capture him, but he continued to slip through their fingers like a vengeful ghost. Sarah read the disturbing message and felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew she was dealing with someone far more sinister than she could imagine. The killer was a predator who had chosen his life as his target, and the feeling of constant terror only intensified. The city remained on constant alert as the real-life killer continued to lurk in the shadows of the night. Sarah knew she would never be truly safe until he was caught, but until then, she would continue to live in the constant terror of the night, looking over her shoulder, waiting for her next encounter with the evil that tormented her. The weeks turned into months, and the city remained in the grip of fear. The real-life killer remained at large, defying authorities with his ability to remain hidden in the shadows. Nightly police patrols multiplied, and the city never really slept. Sarah, meanwhile, lived a life dominated by panic. Every sound of the night made her shudder. Every dark corner of the city tormented her with the fear of a new encounter with the killer. She was exhausted, physically and emotionally, but her determination to overcome this nightmare kept her going. She decided to take drastic measures to regain control of her life. She signed up for self-defense classes and began training diligently. She refused to be a helpless victim again and was determined to face danger head-on. Her apartment was turned into a bunker with reinforced locks and advanced security systems. The police, in turn, were under intense pressure to capture the killer and restore peace to the city. Detectives followed every lead, investigated every tip, but the killer continued to escape their clutches. Theories about his identity and motivations arose, but nothing was clear. He was a deadly enigma who seemed one step ahead of the authorities at all times. One day, a new clue emerged when a local resident reported seeing the killer dressed in his clown mask in a dark alley. The police rushed to the scene, but the killer had disappeared again, leaving only an aura of fear and a feeling of helplessness. The city was on constant alert, but it also came together in solidarity. Neighbors began watching each other, forming night watch groups, and even the most reclusive residents became impromptu vigilantes, determined to capture the killer who haunted them. As the hunt continued, Sarah felt a growing sense of determination in her quest for justice. She began researching obsessively, examining every detail of the case, connecting the dots and following her own clues. She was willing to do anything to help the police find the killer and put an end to this nightmare. One night, while watching the city from her apartment window, Sarah noticed suspicious movement in the room. Down the street, she saw a shadowy figure dressed in a clown mask, moving stealthily through the shadows. Sarah's heart raced, and she knew she had a golden opportunity. She took out her cell phone and dialed the police number, informing them of the killer's presence. As the police approached, Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the killer, determined not to let him get away this time. She was willing to face the evil that had tormented her since that terrible night. The tension in the air was palpable as she and the killer stared at each other from a distance. The sirens of police cars cut through the air, announcing their imminent arrival. The killer, realizing he was cornered, began to back away slowly, still keeping his eyes fixed on Sarah. But before he could disappear into the shadows, the police surrounded him. The murderer's arrest was a relief for the entire city. The man behind the clown mask was led away in handcuffs, finally ending the nightmare that had terrified everyone for so long. Sarah, despite her lingering fear, could finally breathe easier, knowing that the killer would not come back to haunt her. But the face behind the clown mask was even darker than anyone imagined. The killer was a disturbed man with a past filled with tragedy and violence. His capture brought some relief, but it also shed light on the darkness that had taken hold of his mind. The city began to slowly recover from the storm that had hit it. The nights became quieter, and fear gave way to hope for a safer future. Sarah, despite the emotional scars she carried, was determined to move on and get her life back on track. The night's hunt was over, but the emotional wounds would remain forever. The city learned to value safety and solidarity, while Sarah found strength in overcoming her trauma. The real-life killer had been captured, but his sinister legacy would continue to haunt all who faced him in the shadows of night. With the capture of the masked killer, the city finally began to experience a gradual relief from the terror that had haunted it for so long. The news spread like a fire burning in slow motion, bringing a collective sigh of relief. But despite the sense of triumph, an air of mystery and uneasiness persisted. The killer was identified as Richard Malcolm, a middle-aged man with a dark past. His story was filled with personal tragedy, including the traumatic loss of his family in a car accident years ago. This tragedy seemed to have triggered a downward spiral in his mind, leading him to commit terrible acts. While Richard Malcolm was in police custody, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She began obsessively researching him and his previous victims, and something didn't add up. The dates and locations of the attacks did not coincide with the period he was in the city. She felt like something was being hidden. Determined to solve the mystery, Sarah began investigating on her own. She connected with some of the surviving victims of Richard Malcolm's previous attacks and discovered a shocking truth. The man in police custody was not the real killer. The police had made a hasty arrest based on circumstantial evidence and public pressure to solve the case. The real killer was still on the loose, hiding in the shadows, watching as another man paid for his crimes. Sarah realized she needed to act quickly before the real killer committed more crimes. She shared her findings with the police, but they were initially reluctant to reconsider the case. However, with the mounting evidence in their possession, they finally began to reevaluate the situation. The investigation intensified as the city held its breath, waiting for the real killer to be identified and captured. The truth slowly began to emerge, revealing a dark conspiracy involving an internal police accomplice who had covered up the real crimes. Sarah and the police worked together to gather the evidence needed to arrest the real killer and expose the corruption that had permeated the original investigation. As the pieces fell into place, the town was shocked to discover that the real killer was one of their own, a respected police officer who had used his position to cover up his crimes and blame Richard Malcolm. The arrest of the corrupt police officer and the real killer brought overwhelming relief to the city. Finally, justice was being served, and the city could begin to heal from the wounds caused by the night terror that had haunted its streets. However, the trauma persisted for many, especially Sarah. She had delved deeply into the search for truth, and it had left her emotionally exhausted. She also felt responsible for triggering the investigation that revealed corruption within the police. But despite everything, she knew it was necessary, that the truth needed to be revealed. The city came together in recovery from her, seeking mutual support to overcome the horrors of the past. Neighbors became friends, the streets came to life again, and a sense of security began to return to the community. Sarah, in turn, began her own healing journey. She sought professional help to face the trauma she had experienced and found support in survivor groups. She also became involved in causes supporting crime victims, determined to turn her traumatic experience into something positive. The city, now free from the fear that had tormented it for so long, began to rise again. The real-life killer had finally been unmasked and apprehended, and justice had prevailed. The community learned to value security and solidarity, and everyone would remember the time when the darkness of night was overcome by the light of truth and justice.